Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Jeff Pallay, and thanks for being with us. So, with every state legislature in session this year, lawmakers have introduced thousands of bills aiming at reshaping how Americans vote. We've already nearly matched the totals from 2023 and 2024. We're seeing more and more bills. So let's talk about what's been going on so far this year. On this episode, we'll explore the various types of bills moving as we've reached roughly about halfway through the sessions. And we'll focus on which bills have been more popular in states based on who controls the agenda. So in Republican-controlled states, we've seen activities such as bills related to requiring proof of citizenship to register to vote, speed of election night reporting, and banning ranked choice voting. In Democratic states, bills we've seen have focused on expanded voter registration options, increased mail-in ballot access, and expanded ranked choice voting. But it's not all partisan warfare. There have been plenty of bipartisan bills too, with lawmakers coming together on issues like ballot access rules and improving election results reporting. So what do all these legislative trends tell us about the future of voting in America, and what should we be watching as we head into 2026? We just published our most recent report on this type of legislation. So let's talk with our author, Joe Greaney, about everything that was in that report. So, Joe, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Jeff, glad to be here.
So we're going to try to avoid too many number-based observations because, we're listening to this episode. We're not reading a report. If you want all the numbers and graphs and charts, you can read that report in the show links. But for now, let's just get that all out of the way. What are the raw numbers looking like so far this year? I teased that in the intro a little bit, but tell us a little more. What are we seeing with respect to the volume of legislation?
Yeah, I think top line, you hit on it in the intro there a little bit, but we are going to end up passing the previous 2 years, 2023 and 2024, in the total number of election-related bills and resolutions in state legislatures. And there's a couple sort of structural factors there. The fact that, like you said, every state will hold a session this year. That's not true in even years, when there are 4 states that don't. And then I also think that this is just a bit of a continuation of a trend that we've seen really since 2022 and probably going back a little bit further than that, but really since we've been looking at it closely. This is a multi-year trend where the number of total bills related to election legislation continues to go up. And then on new law, so our report focuses on the first 3 months of the year. Our cutoff date was March 11th for the report. And through that time frame this year, there were more new laws, election-related laws adopted than in 2024, when there were 29 adopted, and in 2023, when there were 36 adopted. In that time frame this year, there were 37 adopted. And then just breaking down those numbers a little bit, in each of those 3 years, Republican-sponsored legislation and bills in states with Republican trifectas were the most commonly adopted type of legislation during this period. They also were the most commonly adopted type of legislation throughout the entire year. So that's not all that surprising. But yeah, early returns are matching up with sort of what we expect.
Yeah, and when we follow this legislation, been following elections legislation for probably 5 or 6 years now in a really detailed manner. At the start of each session, we always kind of wonder, okay, is this topic exhausted now? Are we going to start to see the volume of bills tailor off? Are states and legislators done with this area? And best we can tell so far, they're not done yet. There's a combination of tinkering with existing laws, but also introducing new areas. Is that about right with what you've seen?
100%. And there's also new topics that emerge each year, which are you can sort of try and anticipate a little bit based on sort of discourse and rhetoric.
Yeah.
Maybe around election time.
Well, let's get into that a little. So what's standing out so far? What looks different this year from prior years?
Yeah, a new topic this year that I think is really interesting is a sort of bipartisan attention. There's bipartisan attention, and then there's attention from lawmakers of both parties. I think that the two sort of quantities are different things, but both exist right now with respect to the issue of ballot access for candidates, which I think is really interesting. It's not something that we saw a ton of over the last couple of years. I think this is an issue it's not a new issue. This is an issue that lawmakers have paid attention to for a long time.
Yeah.
But there's sort of a secular uptick, it seems, at least, in the attention of lawmakers from both parties towards the topic. We saw just a notable new law adopted in New Jersey this year related to ballot access for candidates that increase signature requirements to get on the ballot for candidates for a number of different office types. So making it a bit harder to get on the ballot, actually. That was not a bipartisan effort in New Jersey. That was mostly supported by Democrats in the state. But we've seen similar efforts elsewhere. And yeah, that's an issue that going into this year, it was on our radar, but I don't think we expected to see as much attention as we have seen so far.
Yeah, ballot access is always such an interesting one. We know from our studies on for state legislative elections that roughly about a third of all general election seats have only one major party candidate. Roughly three-quarters of incumbents don't face a primary challenger. So there's quite a few what you could call kind of uncontested seats. So in this respect, what you're kind of getting at is those who make the laws also govern the rules and regulations for how their challengers come on the ballot against them. And you're saying what we're seeing is that they're kind of tackling that issue a little bit more this year than in prior years.
Yeah, in a couple different ways as well. Like in New Jersey, signature requirements were sort of the focus. Elsewhere, we've seen sort of like new
Hmm.
affidavits or just candidate qualification requirements that have received bipartisan support in a couple of states like Georgia and Utah, basically requiring candidates to attest to their qualifications, newly attest to their qualifications. And those are in particular for county district attorney, attorney general positions, as well as certain judicial positions.
Okay.
And then elsewhere as well, you mentioned the word challenge. We've seen lawmakers revisit the process for challenging a candidate's eligibility as well. Something that we've seen pop up, sort of the idea of challenging voters' eligibility, certainly, but also a candidate's eligibility for an office, sort of challenging the validity of nominating petitions, other aspects of their qualifications for the ballot. And those are, again, efforts that we've seen sort of bipartisan support for this year. And yeah, like you were mentioning, the folks that are in office, the folks that have won election, they've got authority over deciding how they requalify for the ballot and how their challengers also reach the ballot. But yeah, most of the efforts that we've seen in the ballot access space have been focused on either specific offices or sort of an effort like we saw in New Jersey, which is sort of a broad-based
Yeah.
raising the threshold for qualification.
So much of elections administration, and we've heard this from clerks, from state legislators, from secretaries of state, they'll say that at the beginning of every legislative session, what they do is they look back on the prior election cycle. What worked, what didn't. Now let's go back and make tweaks and upgrades. And it's a constant iteration process of improving or, tinkering with how our elections are administered in the country. And again, because we talk about this all the time in the show, our elections are all decentralized. So there's different rules in all the different states, counties, jurisdictions for how you run for office, how you count, when the votes take place, which leads to quite a volume of bills to track and follow. So, what other policy areas do you think are sort of taking priority so far in this session?
Yeah, so we talked about ballot access for candidates, which I think is a little bit of a new focus this year. Again, it's not a new issue, just sort of newly in focus or in focus again, but some issues that have sort of carried momentum from previous sessions and are sort of in the crosshairs of lawmakers' attention are absentee mail-in voting, voter ID, voter registration. I'd say those are three of the biggest ones that we highlight in the report, and we get into sort of specifics under each of those headers in the report as well. I think just to take one and dig in a little bit, absentee mail-in voting, we've seen lawmakers approach sort of both sides of the process there, the aspect of requesting an absentee ballot and then the return process as well. So there's sort of, you can sort of break up the idea of absentee mail-in voting into like getting your ballot and then returning your ballot. And yeah, lawmakers across the country from both parties have been focused on both aspects of that process. Just on the request process, there's been some notable legislation, for example, in Utah, that would pare back automatically mailing absentee ballots. That would actually newly require voters to request absentee ballots when they currently just receive them automatically. And we've seen similar efforts elsewhere, mostly Republican-led, to either narrow the window to request an absentee ballot or sort of restrict who may participate in the process of requesting an absentee ballot. A new law in Wyoming, just to sort of provide some color there, illustrate what I'm talking about. A new law in Wyoming prevents pre-filing of any information on an absentee ballot request form. So whereas in the past, a third-party organization might have been able to send a voter an absentee ballot request form that already had their name and their address filled out on it, sort of helping the voter along the path of requesting a ballot. That's no longer allowed under this new law. We've seen, again, Republican legislators sort of tinker around those edges, make it more voter focused, try and sort of eliminate third-party participation in that process. And then on the other side of the absentee mail-in voting process, the return process, same thing. We've seen Republican-led efforts to try and make sure ballots are returned by Election Day. There's a notable bill in Kansas right now, SB4, which is waiting action from that state's Governor Laura Kelly, Democratic governor, Republican-controlled legislature. The bill would eliminate what they call a grace period. That's not very common terminology for this, but it does illustrate, it gives an idea of, the subject at hand. Currently in Kansas, voters can postmark their ballots by Election Day, but if the ballot is received within 3 days of an election, it's counted. SB4 would remove that 3-day grace period. It would require that all ballots are received by Election Day to be counted. We've seen similar efforts elsewhere, mostly Republican-led, to try and ensure that ballots are sort of received by Election Day to be counted. And then Democratic legislators on the other side of the ledger on absentee mail-in voting are more focused on issues like cure processes, actually trying to make it a bit easier to request a ballot or automatically sending ballots. For example, there's a bill in Maryland that would automatically send absentee mail-in request forms to all voters before the statewide primary. So yeah, we're seeing legislators sort of diverge based on party there. And yeah, happy to get into any of those other issues as well, or keep hopping around.
Yeah, I mean, most of the states in the country right now are a trifecta. They're either controlled by Republicans or they're controlled by Democrats. And typically what that means, right, is that we see each party advancing their agenda in their given state. Are there any examples of particularly interesting divided government states where you're seeing some sort of bipartisan or jointly pushed legislation? Because, again, you talked about Kansas or in Maryland, you've got Democratic state legislators pushing their agenda with their Democratic governor. What about some sort of joint bipartisan kind of topics beyond the ballot acts one we talked about earlier?
So I could probably come back to you with something interesting, but honestly, my answer really is in states with divided governments, we're not seeing a ton of bipartisan cooperation, and it's more we're seeing the party in control of the legislature advance through their partisan priorities and attempting to either force a veto override vote or just pass those priorities through a divided government. So we already talked about Kansas SB4. That's one example. There's a really interesting bill in Arizona, another state with divided government, HB 2703, which was vetoed by the Democratic governor, Katie Hobbs. Again, in Arizona, Republicans control the legislature. Same sort of situation as SB4. Depending on when this goes out, there may have already been a veto override vote on this. Although I do think it appears to me that the legislators in Arizona are moving a bit slower on reconsideration of those vetoes. So HB 2703 in Arizona, again, would advance a number of Republican priorities, including requiring ballots be returned by Election Day. The interesting about that bill is there was an effort to combine what are more often understood as Democratic priorities into that bill to sort of sweeten it a little bit for the Democratic governor, Katie Hobbs. Just an example of what I'm talking about there. That bill also would have extended early voting in Arizona to include the weekend before an election. Currently, early voting ends the Friday before an election in Arizona. The bill would have basically implemented early voting from the Friday when it currently ends through the end of the business day on Monday before an election. It also would have repealed emergency voting during that period and done a number of other things. So there was an attempt in Arizona to sort of sweeten the pot a little bit. Bill was still vetoed because I think Katie Hobbs saw it as, still a little bit too much on the side of Republican priorities. And then Virginia, just to hit on one more state with divided government that's been very active this year. It's sort of, we're going to wait and see right now. There's a number of bills, over 30 election-related bills, awaiting action by Republican Governor Glenn Youngkin. It's an election year in Virginia. A lot of those bills were Democratic partisan priorities. There are a couple pieces of bipartisan legislation in there. Some related to ballot access, like we've already talked about. But yeah, it's going to be a wait and see there. Most of those are Democratic priorities. I'm not going to be surprised if most...
Virginia is a Democratic-controlled legislature, so...
Yes, correct. Democratic-controlled legislature, Republican governor. Yep.
Yeah. So okay. So what you're really getting at is, this continued to be a topic area where the vast majority of legislation that's introduced is pushed by sort of partisans, in their states where they control them. And we see this a lot with the numbers in the report. One of our sort of favorite ways to look at it is it's not just to look at the raw number of bills introduced by party, but also to look specifically in trifecta states where the party in control, how many bills are they introducing? And it's an obvious sort of answer that the vast majority of bills in trifecta states are pushed and introduced by the party in control. And in the minority party introduces very few bills related to election admin in those states because, again, they're not going to have any traction with those.
Yeah, and they're not, yeah, they're more messaging bills. They don't, like you're saying, they don't have the expectation that that's actually going to become law. They're trying to sort of stake out what their priorities are, their platform, oftentimes in opposition to what the party in control is legislating on.
Yeah, it's just a very real reality of our political system and of how legislative politics works. That at times a state legislature will introduce a bill that has no chance of going anywhere, so they can go home to their district and say, "Hey, look, here's a bill that I introduced." And this happens all across the country, across all the parties, across all topic areas. So sifting through the bills, we're trying, we try to decipher out which one of the bills are actually going to move and which one of the bills that are sort of for show, right, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. Jeff, what might be interesting is we kind of already talked about absentee mail-in voting and looked at that issue from both sides, what the Republicans are doing, what the Democrats are doing.
Mhm.
I think it might be interesting to talk about one issue that Republicans are particularly focused on, one that Democrats are particularly focused on, and then maybe we can circle back with an issue that again has some bipartisan attention. How's that sound?
Yeah,
Yeah.
let's do it. Dive right in, Joe. Take the first one at us.
So Republican trifectas, and this is a continuation of a trend that we really saw pick up last year a little bit, but documentary proof of citizenship at the time of voter registration. That's an issue that is at the forefront this year. And unlike it has been in past years. So two states of the Republican trifectas adopted these laws last year. It's New Hampshire and Louisiana. And let me just explain what I mean by these laws.
No, tell us.
They're requirements to provide documentary proof of it's kind of self-explanatory, but it's worth explaining again. There are requirements to provide documentary proof of citizenship. So either a passport, a birth certificate, a social security card, or other qualified document as defined in state law at the time of voter registration. So currently every state requires citizens to either provide documentary proof of citizenship. That's actually only two states right now, and it's not Louisiana, which adopted a law last year, but that's a whole separate conversation. Or they require a voter to attest to their citizenship under penalty of perjury or other penalty. So there's a number of Republican-led states that are trying to move towards requiring a voter registration applicant to provide that proof of citizenship rather than just checking the box when they register to vote. And we've seen these types of bills introduced in at least 19 states so far this year, including at least 11 states, the Republican trifectas. So, and again, before sort of last year, we saw two states adopt these laws. This is an issue that popped up sort of every couple of years, but not at this scale, not as widespread as we've seen it this year. I expect a number of those states to adopt those laws this year. None of them have been adopted so far, but I expect that to be sort of a developing story throughout the year. There's a whole separate conversation to get into there, which is about enforcement of those laws. I don't think this is the place to get into it, but go check out our coverage on site or the report for more information about that. Going to the Democratic side and sticking with voter registration, we've seen a couple of Democratic trifectas prioritize expansions of same-day or automatic voter registration. Two states, so currently only 6 states with Democratic trifectas, and I think we're at 13 states right now. 15, excuse me. So only 6 of the 15 states with Democratic trifectas do not currently have same-day voter registration. 2 of those states, New Jersey and New York, are considering adopting same-day voter registration this year, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see some of those remaining Democratic trifecta holdouts also consider establishing some sort of same-day voter registration this year. And then automatic voter registration is sort of the other piece there.
Good.
We've seen a couple states, including Hawaii and Washington, consider expanding the availability of automatic voter registration. And what that really means is basically authorizing other state agencies who oftentimes already collect the required information for voter registration to provide those services when an eligible citizen interacts with those state agencies. So just two very different approaches to voter registration, or two very different aspects of voter registration that are a focus of Republicans on the one side and Democrats on the other. And then sort of voter registration related, but on the back end is the topic of voter list maintenance, which is ensuring that everybody that is registered, that's on what we call voter rolls, the list of eligible voters, is actually eligible and should be registered. So this is an area where we've actually seen quite a bit of, we've seen both sort of partisan tension and bipartisan agreement. I think the interesting thing here is I think that there's broad consensus among partisan lawmakers on both sides that voter list maintenance is good. You want accurate, nobody's disputing that. You want accurate voter rolls. You want to make sure that, if there's an issue with somebody's voter registration, that they're afforded an opportunity to address that. You want to make sure that there's sort of regular maintenance, regular cleanups of those voter rolls. Again, I think there's pretty broad agreement among Democratic and Republican lawmakers on that sort of premise. How to actually do it sometimes results in disagreements, the question of how to actually do it. But we have generally seen some bipartisan momentum around sort of increasing the frequency of voter list maintenance activities, expanding data sources that might be used for voter list maintenance. And then we've also seen sort of partisan priorities. There's sort of organizations, practices that Republicans don't like, and likewise for Democrats. So while they agree on the premise and have been able to agree on some specifics, in some states, there's also sort of disagreement at the edges. Just an interesting topic in that regard.
Well, we're only 2 months into the session now. Now we get to see over the next few months is which of these bills actually get enacted, what new surprises come about in the next couple of months, and how do these sessions shake out. Oftentimes, you get that sort of rogue special session that gets called later in the summer to, re-tackle on issues that didn't get completed. So lots to continue to stay and follow on top of in the next few months. What other trend do you think will come out that we haven't touched on yet before we wrap up for this episode?
Yeah, just some things that actually aren't in there. So just for any listeners, other things in the report that we didn't talk about, just we're highlighting a couple specific states who are either sort of well along in their legislative session this year or have actually already adjourned for the year. Two states have already adjourned and are done for the year. That's Wyoming and Utah. So you can go check out takeaways from their legislative sessions in the report, along with takeaways from a couple other specific states that have been particularly active to date. And then some other topics that we cover in the report as well, ranked choice voting, which you touched on in the intro a little bit, Jeff. We're just seeing a continuation of past trends there so far this year. Two states actually in the last week have newly banned ranked choice voting after governors in West Virginia and Wyoming signed bills that had passed the legislature. Both those bills were signed into law on March 18th. So that brings the total number of states banning ranked choice voting up to 12. We're seeing a large number of bills that would authorize new uses of RCV sort of on the other side of the band, but none of those are really advancing at the moment.
In Democratic states, typically, for that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, mostly. Actually, what's interesting this year is we've seen a lot of those bills introduced in states with Republican trifectas, which, again, to what we were just talking about earlier, those bills are sort of dead on arrival. They're not really going to go anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen more of that this year. So I wonder if there's, you could sort of dig into the thinking behind that and draw some conclusions about maybe the politics of the issue.
Right.
And then we also get into another sort of aspect of ballot access, which is ballot access for initiatives and referendums. This has been a big focus of Republican legislators this year in a number of states, oftentimes making it a bit harder for initiatives to reach the ballot. Arkansas has been a big outlier this year, adopting over 9 bills related to ballot access for initiatives. And go read more about that in the report as well. There's some fun takeaways, some interesting bills covered there. And then just some topics I'd love to tease that we actually don't really get into in the report, but I think are you'd be wise to keep them sort of in view as sessions progress this year. A big one is consolidation of election dates. We've seen a number of states consider bills, especially states with odd year election cycles. They would move those elections to even years or sort of get rid of
or spring elections. Yeah.
authorized get rid of spring elections, consolidate them with regular statewide election dates. There's a lot of momentum there this year, including some of the big odd year states, Virginia, that just authorized a new study committee to sort of explore what that would look like. And yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting year on the whole, and there's plenty to keep an eye on in addition to that.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to have you back on when we do our mid-year session recap, which will happen in a couple months. And if you can't wait until then, listeners, you can follow along with all of this reporting and coverage at Ballotpedia's Elections Administration Legislation Tracker at legislation.ballotpedia.org/elections. Joe, always great to have you on the show, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Jeff.
So for our listeners, you can learn more about our elections administration coverage at the link in our show notes. We'll be back with another episode very soon. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Jeff Pallett, and thanks for listening.